Section 21 of Essays of Schopenhauer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Arden. Essays of Schopenhauer by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by Sara Dircks. The Metaphysics of Love, Part 3. The following is necessary for this neutralization of which we are speaking. The particular degree of his manhood must exactly correspond to the particular degree of her womanhood, in order to exactly balance the one-sidedness of each. Hence, the most manly man will desire the most womanly woman, and vice versa, and so each will want the individual that exactly corresponds to him in degree of sex. Inasmuch as two persons fulfill this necessary relation towards each other, it is instinctively felt by them, and is the origin, together with the other relative considerations, of the higher degrees of love. While, therefore, two lovers are pathetically talking about the harmony of their souls, the kernel of the conversation is for the most part the harmony concerning the individual and its perfection, which obviously is of much more importance than the harmony of their souls, which frequently turns out to be a violent discord shortly after marriage. We now come to those other relative considerations which depend on each individual trying to eradicate, through the medium of another, his weaknesses, deficiencies, and deviations from the type, in order that they may not be perpetuated in the child that is to be born, or develop into absolute abnormities. The weaker a man is in muscular power, the more will he desire a woman who is muscular, and the same thing applies to a woman. Nevertheless, if a big woman choose a big husband, in order perhaps to present a better appearance in society, the children, as a rule, suffer for her folly. Again, another very decided consideration is complexion. Blonde people fancy either absolutely dark complexions or brown, but it is rarely the case vice versa. The reason for it is this, that fair hair and blue eyes are a deviation from the type, and almost constitute an abnormity, analogous to white mice, or at any rate white horses. They are not indigenous to any other part of the world but Europe, not even to the polar regions, and are obviously of Scandinavian origin. En passant, it is my conviction that a white skin is not natural to man, and that by nature he has either a black or brown skin, like our forefathers, the Hindus, and that the white man was never originally created by nature, and that therefore there is no race of white people, much as it is talked about, but every white man is a bleached one, driven up into the north, where he was a stranger, and where he existed only like an exotic plant, in need of a hothouse in winter. Man, in the course of centuries, became white. The Gypsies, an Indian tribe which emigrated only about 4 centuries ago, show the transition of the Hindu's complexion to ours. In love, therefore, nature strives to return to dark hair and brown eyes, because they are the original type. Still, a white skin has become second nature, although not to such an extent as to make the dark skin of the Hindu repellent to us. Finally, every man tries to find the corrective of his own defects and aberrations in the particular parts of his body, and the more conspicuous the defect is, the greater is his determination to correct it. This is why snub-nosed persons find an aquiline nose or a parrot-like face so indescribably pleasing, and the same thing applies to every other part of the body. Men of immoderately long and attenuated build delight in a stunted and short figure. Considerations of temperament also influence a man's choice. Each prefers a temperament the reverse of his own, but only insofar as his is a decided one. A man who is quite perfect in some respect himself does not, it is true, desire and love imperfection in this particular respect, yet he can be more easily reconciled to it than another man, because he himself saves the children from being very imperfect in this particular. For instance, a man who has a very white skin himself will not dislike a yellowish complexion, while a man who has a yellowish complexion will consider a dazzlingly white skin divinely beautiful. It is rare for a man to fall in love with a positively ugly woman, but when he does, it is because exact harmony in the degree of sex exists between them, and all her abnormities are precisely the opposite to, that is to say, the corrective of his. Love in these circumstances is wont to attain a high degree. The profoundly earnest way in which we criticize and narrowly consider every part of a woman, while she on her part considers us, the scrupulously careful way we scrutinize a woman who is beginning to please us, the fickleness of our choice, the strained attention with which a man watches his fiancée, the care he takes not to be deceived in any trait, and the great importance he attaches to every more or less essential trait. All this is quite in keeping with the importance of the end, for the child that is to be born will have to bear a similar trait through its whole life. For instance, if a woman stoops but a little, it is possible for her son to be inflicted with a hunchback, and so in every other respect. We are not conscious of all this naturally. On the contrary, each man imagines that his choice is made in the interest of his own pleasure, which, in reality, cannot be interested in it at all. His choice, which we must take for granted, is in keeping with his own individuality, is made precisely in the interest of the species, to maintain the type of which as pure as possible is the secret task. In this case, the individual unconsciously acts in the interest of something higher, that is, the species. This is why he attaches so much importance to things to which he might, nay, would be otherwise indifferent. There is something quite singular in the unconsciously serious and critical way two young people of different sex look at each other on meeting for the first time, in the scrutinizing and penetrating glances they exchange, in the careful inspection which their various traits undergo. This scrutiny and analysis represent the meditation of the genius of the species on the individual which may be born and the combination of its qualities, and the greatness of their delight in and longing for each other is determined by this meditation. This longing, although it may have become intense, may possibly disappear again if something previously unobserved comes to light, and so the genius of the species meditates concerning the coming race in all who are not yet too old. It is Cupid's work to fashion this race, and he is always busy, always speculating, always meditating. The affairs of the individual in their whole ephemeral totality are very trivial compared with those of this divinity, which concern the species and the coming race. Therefore, he is always ready to sacrifice the individual regardlessly. He is related to these ephemeral affairs as an immortal being is to a mortal, and his interests to theirs as infinite to finite. Conscious, therefore, of administering affairs of a higher order than those that concern merely the weal and woe of the individual, he administers them with sublime indifference amid the tumult of war, the bustle of business, or the raging of a plague. Indeed, he pursues them into the seclusion of the cloisters. It has been seen that the intensity of love grows with its individuation. We have shown that two individuals may be so physically constituted that in order to restore the best possible type of the species, the one is the special and perfect complement of the other, which in consequence exclusively desires it. In a case of this kind, passionate love arises, and as it is bestowed on one object, and one only, that is to say, because it appears in the special service of the species, it immediately assumes a nobler and sublimer nature. On the other hand, mere sexual instinct is base, because, without individuation, it is directed to all, and strives to preserve the species merely as regards quantity, with little regard for quality. Intense love concentrated on one individual may develop to such a degree that unless it is gratified, all the good things of this world, and even life itself, lose their importance. It then becomes a desire, the intensity of which is like none other. Consequently, it will make any kind of sacrifice, and should it happen that it cannot be gratified, it may lead to madness or even suicide. Besides these unconscious considerations, which are the source of passionate love, there must be still others, which we have not so directly before us. Therefore, we must take it for granted that here there is not only a fitness of constitution, but also a special fitness between the man's will and the woman's intellect, in consequence of which a perfectly definite individual can be born to them alone, whose existence is contemplated by the genius of the species for reasons to us impenetrable, since they are the very essence of the thing in itself, or more strictly speaking, the will to live desires to objectivize itself in an individual which is precisely determined, and can only be begotten by this particular father and this particular mother. This metaphysical yearning of the will in itself has immediately, as its sphere of action in the circle of human beings, the hearts of the future parents, who accordingly are seized with this desire. They now fancy that it is for their own sakes they are longing for what at present has purely a metaphysical end, that is to say, for what does not come within the range of things that exist in reality. In other words, it is the desire of the future individual to enter existence, which has first become possible here, a longing which proceeds from the primary source of all being, and exhibits itself in the phenomenal world as the intense love of the future parents for each other, and has little regard for anything outside itself. In fact, love is an illusion like no other. It will induce a man to sacrifice everything he possesses in the world in order to obtain this woman, who in reality will satisfy him no more than any other. It also ceases to exist when the end, which was in reality metaphysical, has been frustrated perhaps by the woman's barrenness, which, according to Hoofland, is the result of 19 accidental defects in the constitution, just as it is frustrated daily in millions of crushed germs in which the same metaphysical life principle struggles to exist. There is no other consolation in this than that there is an infinity of space, time, and matter, and consequently inexhaustible opportunity, at the service of the will to live. Although this subject has not been treated by Theophrastus Paracelsus, and my entire train of thought is foreign to him, yet it must have presented itself to him, if even in a cursory way, when he gave utterance to the following remarkable words, written in quite a different context, and in his usual desultory style. Hae sunt, quos Deus copulavit, ut eam quae fuit Uriae et David, quamvis ex diametro, sic enim sibi humana mens persuadebat, cum justo et legitimo matrimonio puniaret hoc, sed propter Salomonum, qui alunde nasci non potuit, nisi ex Bathseba conjuncto David semine, quamvis meretrice conjunxit Deos. The yearning of love, the himeros, which has been expressed in countless ways and forms by the poets of all ages, without their exhausting the subject, or even doing it justice, this longing, which makes us imagine that the possession of a certain woman will bring interminable happiness, and the loss of her unspeakable pain. This longing and this pain do not arise from the needs of an ephemeral individual, but are, on the contrary, the sigh of the spirit of the species, discerning irreparable means of either gaining or losing its ends. It is the species alone that has an interminable existence. Hence it is capable of endless desire, endless gratification, and endless pain. These, however, are imprisoned in the heart of the mortal. No wonder, therefore, if it seems like to burst, and can find no expression for the announcements of endless joy or endless pain. This it is that forms the substance of all erotic poetry that is sublime in character, which consequently soars into transcendent metaphors, surpassing everything earthly. This is the theme of Petrarch, the material for the St. Preux, Werthers, and Jacopo Ortiz, who otherwise could be neither understood nor explained. This infinite regard is not based on any kind of intellectual, nor, in general, upon any real merits of the beloved one, because the lover frequently does not know her well enough, as was the case with Petrarch. It is the spirit of the species alone that can see at a glance of what value the beloved one is to it for its purposes. Moreover, great passions, as a rule, originate at first sight. Whoever loved that loved not at first sight? Shakespeare, As You Like It, 3:5. Curiously enough, there is a passage touching upon this in Guzman del Alfarache, a well-known romance written 250 years ago by Mateo Alemán. No es necesario para que uno ame, que pasa distancia de tiempo, que siga discurso en haga elección, sino que con aquella primera y sola vista concurran juntamente cierta correspondencia o consonancia, o lo que acá solemos vulgarmente decir, una confrontación de sangre, a que por particular influxo suelen mover las estrellas. For a man to love, there is no need for any length of time to pass for him to weigh considerations or make his choice, but only that a certain correspondence and consonance is encountered on both sides at the first and only glance, or that which is ordinarily called a sympathy of blood, to which a peculiar influence of the stars generally impels. Accordingly, the loss of the beloved one through a rival, or through death, is the greatest pain of all to those passionately in love, just because it is of a transcendental nature, since it affects him not merely as an individual, but also assails him in his essentia aeterna, in the life of the species, in whose special will and service he was here called. This is why jealousy is so tormenting and bitter, and the giving up of the loved one the greatest of all sacrifices. My hero is ashamed of showing any kind of emotion but that which may be the outcome of love. The reason for this is that when he is in love, it is not he, but the species, which is grieving. In Calderon's Zenobia the Great, there is a scene in the second act between Zenobia and Decius, where the latter says, Celos, luego tú me quieres, perdiera 100,000 victorias, volvierme, etc. Heavens, then you love me. For this I would sacrifice 1,000 victories, etc. In this case, honor, which has hitherto outweighed every other interest, is driven out of the field directly. Love, i.e., the interest of the species, comes into play and discerns something that will be of decided advantage to itself, for the interest of the species, compared with that of the mere individual, however important this may be, is infinitely more important. Honor, duty, and fidelity succumb to it after they have withstood every other temptation, the menace of death even. We find the same going on in private life. For instance, a man has less conscience when in love than in any other circumstances. Conscience is sometimes put on one side, even by people who are otherwise honest and straightforward, and infidelity recklessly committed if they are passionately in love, i.e., when the interest of the species has taken possession of them. It would seem, indeed, as if they believe themselves conscious of a greater authority than the interests of individuals could ever confer. This is simply because they are concerned in the interests of the species. Chamfort's utterance in this respect is remarkable. Quand un homme et une femme ont l'un pour l'autre une passion violente, il me semble toujours que quels soient les obstacles qui les séparent, un mari, des parents, etc. Les deux amants sont l'un à l'autre de par la nature, qu'ils s'appartiennent de droit divin, malgré les lois et les conventions humaines. From this standpoint, the greater part of the Decameron seems a mere mocking and jeering on the part of the genius of the species at the rights and interests of the individual which it treads underfoot. Inequality of rank and all similar relations are put on one side with the same indifference and disregarded by the genius of the species. If they thwart the union of two people passionately in love with one another, it pursues its ends pertaining to endless generations, scattering human principles and scruples abroad like chaff. For the same reason, a man will willingly risk every kind of danger, and even become courageous, although he may otherwise be faint-hearted. What a delight we take in watching, either in a play or novel, two young lovers fighting for each other, i.e., for the interest of the species, and their defeat of the old people, who had only in view the welfare of the individual. For the struggling of a pair of lovers seems to us so much more important, delightful, and consequently justifiable than any other, as the species is more important than the individual. Accordingly, we have as the fundamental subject of almost all comedies the genius of the species with its purposes running counter to the personal interests of the individuals presented, and in consequence threatening to undermine their happiness. As a rule, it carries out its ends, which in keeping with true poetic justice satisfies the spectator, because the latter feels that the purposes of the species widely surpass those of the individual. Hence he is quite consoled when he finally takes leave of the victorious lovers, sharing with them the illusion that they have established their own happiness, while in truth they have sacrificed it for the welfare of the species, in opposition to the will of the discreet old people. End of section 21. Recording by Arden. Section 22 of Essays of Schopenhauer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Arden. Essays of Schopenhauer by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by Sara Dircks. The Metaphysics of Love, Part 4. It has been attempted in a few out-of-the-way comedies to reverse the state of things and to affect the happiness of the individuals at the cost of the ends of the species. But here the spectator is sensible of the pain inflicted on the genius of the species, and does not find consolation in the advantages that are assured to the individuals. Two very well-known little pieces occur to me as examples of this kind: La Reine de Cézanne and Le Mariage de Raison. In the love affairs that are treated in tragedies, the lovers, as a rule, perish together. The reason for this is that the purposes of the species, whose tools the lovers were, have been frustrated, as for instance in Romeo and Juliet, Tancred, Don Carlos, Wallenstein, The Bride of Messina, and so on. A man in love frequently furnishes comic as well as tragic aspects, for being in the possession of the spirit of the species and controlled by it, he no longer belongs to himself, and consequently his line of conduct is not in keeping with that of the individual. It is fundamentally this that in the higher phases of love gives such a poetical and sublime color, nay, transcendental and hyperphysical turn to a man's thoughts, whereby he appears to lose sight of his essentially material purpose. He is inspired by the spirit of the species, whose affairs are infinitely more important than any which concern mere individuals, in order to establish by special mandate of this spirit the existence of an indefinitely long posterity with this particular and precisely determined nature, which it can receive only from him as father and his loved one as mother, and which, moreover, as such, never comes into existence, while the objectivation of the will to live expressly demands this existence. It is the feeling that he is engaged in affairs of such transcendent importance that exalts the lover above everything earthly, nay, indeed, above himself, and gives such a hyperphysical clothing to his physical wishes, that love becomes, even in the life of the most prosaic, a poetical episode, and then the affair often assumes a comical aspect. That mandate of the will which objectifies itself in the species presents itself in the consciousness of the lover under the mask of the anticipation of an infinite happiness, which is to be found in his union with this particular woman. This allusion to a man deeply in love becomes so dazzling that if it cannot be attained, life itself not only loses all charm, but appears to be so joyless, hollow, and uninteresting as to make him too disgusted with it to be afraid of the terrors of death. This is why he sometimes of his own free will cuts his life short. The will of a man of this kind has become engulfed in that of the species, or the will of the species has obtained so great an ascendancy over the will of the individual that if such a man cannot be effective in the manifestation of the first, he disdains to be so in the last. The individual in this case is too weak a vessel to bear the infinite longing of the will of the species concentrated upon a definite object. When this is the case, suicide is the result, and sometimes suicide of the two lovers, unless nature, to prevent this, causes insanity, which then enshrouds with its veil the consciousness of so hopeless a condition. The truth of this is confirmed yearly by various cases of this description. However, it is not only unrequited love that leads frequently to a tragic end, for requited love more frequently leads to unhappiness than to happiness. This is because its demands often so severely clash with the personal welfare of the lover concerned as to undermine it, since the demands are incompatible with the lover's other circumstances, and in consequence destroy the plans of life built upon them. Further, love frequently runs counter not only to external circumstances, but to the individuality itself, for it may fling itself upon a person who, apart from the relation of sex, may become hateful, despicable, nay, even repulsive. As the will of the species, however, is so very much stronger than that of the individual, the lover shuts his eyes to all objectionable qualities, overlooks everything, ignores all, and unites himself forever to the object of his passion. He is so completely blinded by this illusion that as soon as the will of the species is accomplished, the illusion vanishes, and leaves in its place a hateful companion for life. From this it is obvious why we often see very intelligent, nay, distinguished men married to dragons and she-devils, and why we cannot understand how it was possible for them to make such a choice. Accordingly, the ancients represented Amor as blind. In fact, it is possible for a lover to clearly recognize and be bitterly conscious of horrid defects in his fiancée's disposition and character, defects which promise him a life of misery, and yet for him not to be filled with fear. I ask not, I care not, if guilt's in thy heart. I know that I love thee, whatever thou art. For in truth he is not acting in his own interest, but in that of a third person, who was yet to come into existence, albeit he is under the impression that he is acting in his own. But it is this very acting in someone else's interest which is everywhere the stamp of greatness, and gives to passionate love the touch of the sublime, making it a worthy subject for the poet. Finally, a man may both love and hate his beloved at the same time. Accordingly, Plato compares a man's love to the love of a wolf for a sheep. We have an instance of this kind when a passionate lover, in spite of all his exertions and entreaties, cannot obtain a hearing upon any terms. I love and hate her. Shakespeare, Cymbeline, 3:5. When hatred is kindled, a man will sometimes go so far as to first kill his beloved and then himself. Examples of this kind are brought before our notice yearly in the newspapers. Therefore Goethe says truly, Bei aller verschmachten Liebe beim heiligen Elemente. Ich wusst was Augas, dass ich fluchen konnte. It is in truth no hyperbole on the part of a lover when he calls his beloved's coldness, or the joy of her vanity, which delights in his suffering, cruelty. For he has come under the influence of an impulse which, akin to the instinct of animals, compels him, in spite of all reason, to unconditionally pursue his end and discard every other. He cannot give it up. There has not been one, but many a Petrarch, who, failing to have his love requited, has been obliged to drag through life as if his feet were either fettered or carried a leaden weight, and give vent to his sighs in a lonely forest. Nevertheless, there was only one Petrarch who possessed the true poetic instinct, so that Goethe's beautiful lines are true of him. Und wenn der Mensch in seiner Qual verstummt, gab mir ein Gott zu sagen, wie ich leide. As a matter of fact, the genius of the species is at continual warfare with the guardian genius of individuals. It is its pursuer and enemy. It is always ready to relentlessly destroy personal happiness in order to carry out its ends. Indeed, the welfare of whole nations has sometimes been sacrificed to its caprice. Shakespeare furnishes us with such an example in Henry VI, Part 3, Act 3, Scenes 2 and 3. This is because the species, in which lies the germ of our being, has a nearer and prior claim upon us than the individual, so that the affairs of the species are more important than those of the individual. Sensible of this, the ancients personified the genius of the species in Cupid, notwithstanding his having the form of a child, as a hostile and cruel god, and therefore one to be decried as a capricious and despotic demon, and yet lord of both gods and men. Si verita theon tyranne canthropon eros. 2. Diorum omnimque tyranne amor. Murderous darts, blindness, and wings are Cupid's attributes. The latter signify inconstancy, which as a rule comes with a disillusion following possession. Because, for instance, love is based on an illusion, and represents what is an advantage to the species as an advantage to the individual, the illusion necessarily vanishes directly when the end of the species has been attained. The spirit of the species, which for the time being has got the individual into its possession, now frees him again. Deserted by the spirit, he relapses into his original state of narrowness and want. He is surprised to find that after all his lofty, heroic, and endless attempts to further his own pleasure, he has obtained but little, and contrary to his expectation, he finds that he is no happier than he was before. He discovers that he has been the dupe of the will of the species. Therefore, as a rule, a Theseus who has been made happy will desert his Ariadne. If Petrarch's passion had been gratified, his song would have become silent from that moment, as that of the birds as soon as the eggs are laid. Let it be said in passing that however much my metaphysics of love may displease those in love, the fundamental truth revealed by me would enable them more effectually than anything else to overcome their passion, if considerations of reason in general could be of any avail. The words of the comic poet of ancient times remain good. Quae res in se neque concilium, neque modum abit ullum, eam concilio regere non potes. People who marry for love do so in the interests of the species, and not of the individuals. It is true that the persons concerned imagine they are promoting their own happiness, but their real aim, which is one they are unconscious of, is to bring forth an individual which can be begotten by them alone. This purpose having brought them together, they ought henceforth to try and make the best of things. But it very frequently happens that two people who have been brought together by this instinctive illusion, which is the essence of passionate love, are in every other respect temperamentally different. This becomes apparent when the illusion wears off, as it necessarily must. Accordingly, people who marry for love are generally unhappy, for such people look after the welfare of the future generation at the expense of the present. Quien se casa por amores ha de vivir con dolores. He who marries for love must live in grief, says the Spanish proverb. Marriages de convenance, which are generally arranged by the parents, will turn out the reverse. The considerations in this case which control them, whatever their nature may be, are at any rate real. and unable to vanish of themselves. A marriage of this kind attends to the welfare of the present generation to the detriment of the future, it is true, and yet this remains problematical. A man who marries for money, and not for love, lives more in the interest of the individual than in that of the species, a condition exactly opposed to truth. Therefore it is unnatural and rouses a certain feeling of contempt. A girl who against the wish of her parents refuses to marry a rich man, still young, and ignores all considerations of convenance, in order to choose another instinctively to her liking, sacrifices her individual welfare to the species. But it is for this very reason that she meets with a certain approval, for she has given preference to what was more important, and acted in the spirit of nature, of the species, more exactly, while the parents advised only in the spirit of individual egotism. As the outcome of all this, it seems that to marry means that either the interests of the individual or the interests of the species must suffer. As a rule, one or the other is the case, for it is only by the rarest and luckiest accident that convenance and passionate love go hand in hand. The wretched condition of most persons physically, morally, and intellectually may be partly accounted for by the fact that marriages are not generally the result of pure choice and inclination, but of all kinds of external considerations and accidental circumstances. However, if inclination to a certain degree is taken into consideration, as well as convenience, this is, as it were, a compromise with the genius of the species. As is well known, happy marriages are few and far between, since marriage is intended to have the welfare of the future generation at heart and not the present. However, let me add for the consolation of the more tender-hearted that passionate love is sometimes associated with a feeling of quite another kind, namely, real friendship founded on harmony of sentiment. But this, however, does not exist until the instinct of sex has been extinguished. This friendship will generally spring from the fact that the physical, moral, and intellectual qualities which correspond to and supplement each other in two individuals in love, in respect of the child to be born, will also supplement each other in respect of the individuals themselves as opposite qualities of temperament and intellectual excellence, and thereby establish a harmony of sentiment. The whole metaphysics of love, which has been treated here, is closely related to my metaphysics in general, and the light it throws upon this may be said to be as follows. We have seen that a man's careful choice, developing through innumerable degrees to passionate love, for the satisfaction of his instinct of sex, is based upon the fundamental interest he takes in the constitution of the next generation. This overwhelming interest that he takes verifies two truths which have already been demonstrated. First, man's immortality, which is perpetuated in the future race, for this interest of so active and zealous a nature, which is neither the result of reflection nor intention, springs from the innermost characteristics and tendencies of our being, could not exist so continuously, or exercise such great power over man, if the latter were really transitory, and if a race really and totally different to himself succeeded him merely in point of time. Second, that his real nature is more closely allied to the species than to the individual, for this interest that he takes in the special nature of the species, which is the source of all love, from the most fleeting emotion to the most serious passion, is in reality the most important affair in each man's life, the successful or unsuccessful issue of which touches him more nearly than anything else. This is why it has been preeminently called the affair of the heart. Everything that merely concerns one's own person is set aside and sacrificed, if the case require it, to this interest when it is of a strong and decided nature. Therefore, in this way, man proves that he is more interested in the species than in the individual, and that he lives more directly in the interests of the species than in that of the individual. Why then is a lover so absolutely devoted to every look and turn of his beloved, and ready to make any kind of sacrifice for her? Because the immortal part of him is yearning for her. It is only the mortal part of him that longs for everything else. That keen and even intense longing for a particular woman is accordingly a direct pledge of the immortality of the essence of our being, and of its perpetuity in the species. To regard this perpetuity as something unimportant and insufficient is an error, arising from the fact that in thinking of the continuity of the species, we only think of the future existence of beings similar to ourselves, but in no respect, however, identical with us. And again, starting from knowledge directed towards without, we only grasp the outer form of the species as it presents itself to us, and do not take into consideration its inner nature, It is precisely this inner nature that lies at the foundation of our own consciousness as its kernel, and therefore is more direct than our consciousness itself, and as thing in itself exempt from the principium individuationis, is in reality identical and the same in all individuals, whether they exist at the same or at different times. This, then, is the will to live. That is to say, it is exactly that which so intensely desires both life and continuance, and which accordingly remains unharmed and unaffected by death. Further, its present state cannot be improved, and while there is life, it is certain of the unceasing sufferings and death of the individual. The denial of the will to live is reserved to free it from this, as the means by which the individual will breaks away from the stem of the species, and surrenders that existence in it. We are wanting both in ideas and all data as to what it is after that. We can only indicate it as something which is free to be, will to live, or not to live. Buddhism distinguishes the latter case by the word nirvana. It is the point which as such remains forever impenetrable to all human knowledge. Looking at the turmoil of life from this standpoint, we find all occupied with its want and misery, exerting all their strength in order to satisfy its endless needs and avert manifold suffering, without, however, daring to expect anything else in return than merely the preservation of this tormented individual existence for a short span of time. And yet, amid all this turmoil, we see a pair of lovers exchanging longing glances. Yet why so secretly, timidly, and stealthily? Because these lovers are traitors secretly striving to perpetuate all this misery and turmoil that otherwise would come to a timely end. End of section 22. Recording by Arden.
Section 23 of Essays of Schopenhauer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Andrea. Essays of Schopenhauer by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by Sara Dircks. Physiognomy. That the outside reflects the inner man, and that the face expresses his whole character, is an obvious supposition, and accordingly a safe one, demonstrated as it is in the desire people have to see on all occasions a man who has distinguished himself by something good or evil, or produced some exceptional work. Or if this is denied them, at any rate to hear from others what he looks like. This is why, on the one hand, they go to places where they conjecture he is to be found, and on the other, why the press, and especially the English press, tries to describe him in a minute and striking way. He is soon brought visibly before us, either by a painter or an engraver, and finally, photography, on that account so highly prized, meets this necessity in a most perfect way. It is also proved in everyday life that each one inspects the physiognomy of those he comes in contact with, and first of all secretly tries to discover their moral and intellectual character from their features. This could not be the case if, as some foolish people state, the outward appearance of a man is of no importance. Nay, if the soul is one thing and the body another, and the latter related to the soul as the coat is to the man himself. Rather is every human face a hieroglyph, which, to be sure, admits of being deciphered, nay, the whole alphabet of which we carry about with us. Indeed, the face of a man, as a rule, bespeaks more interesting matter than his tongue, for it is the compendium of all which he will ever say, as it is the register of all his thoughts and aspirations. Moreover, the tongue only speaks the thoughts of one man, while the face expresses a thought of nature. Therefore, it is worthwhile to observe everybody attentively, even if they are not worth talking to. Every individual is worthy of observation as a single thought of nature. So is beauty in the highest degree, for it is a higher and more general conception of nature. It is her thought of a species. This is why we are so captivated by beauty. It is a fundamental and principal thought of nature, whereas the individual is only a secondary thought, a corollary. In secret, everybody goes upon the principle that a man is what he looks, but the difficulty lies in its application. The ability to apply it is partly innate and partly acquired by experience, but no one understands it thoroughly, for even the most experienced may still make a mistake. Still, it is not the face that deceives, whatever Figaro may say, but it is we who are deceived in reading what is not there. The deciphering of the face is certainly a great and difficult art. Its principles can never be learned in abstracto. Its first condition is that the man must be looked at from a purely objective point of view, which is not so easy to do. As soon as, for instance, there is the slightest sign of dislike or affection or fear or hope, or even the thought of the impression which we ourselves are making on him, in short, as soon as anything of a subjective nature is present, the hieroglyphics become confused and falsified. The sound of a language is only heard by one who does not understand it, because in thinking of the significance, one is not conscious of the sign itself. And similarly, the physiognomy of a man is only seen by one to whom it is still strange, that is to say, by one who has not become accustomed to his face through seeing him often or talking to him. Accordingly, it is, strictly speaking, the first glance that gives one a purely objective impression of a face, and makes it possible for one to decipher it. A smell only affects us when we first perceive it, and is the first glass of wine which gives us its real taste. In the same way, it is only when we see a face for the first time that it makes a full impression upon us. Therefore, one should carefully attend to the first impression. One should make a note of it, nay, write it down if the man is of personal importance. That is, if one can trust one's own sense of physiognomy. Subsequent acquaintance and intercourse will erase that impression, but it will be verified one day in the future. En passant, let us not conceal from ourselves the fact that this first impression is as a rule extremely disagreeable. But how little there is in the majority of faces! With the exception of those that are beautiful, good-natured, and intellectual, that is, the very few and exceptional, I believe a new face for the most part gives a sensitive person a sensation akin to a shock, since the disagreeable impression is presented in a new and surprising combination. As a rule, it is indeed a sorry sight. There are individuals whose faces are stamped with such naive vulgarity and lowness of character, such an animal imitation of intelligence, that one wonders how they care to go out with such a face and do not prefer to wear a mask. Nay, there are faces a mere glance at which makes one feel contaminated. One cannot therefore blame people who are in a position to do so if they seek solitude and escape the painful sensation of seeing new faces. The metaphysical explanation of this rests on the consideration that the individuality of each person is exactly that by which he should be reclaimed and corrected. If anyone, on the other hand, will be content with a psychological explanation, let him ask himself what kind of physiognomy can be expected in those whose minds, their whole life long, have scarcely ever entertained anything but petty, mean, and miserable thoughts, and vulgar, selfish, jealous, wicked, and spiteful desires. Each one of these thoughts and desires has left its impress on the face for the length of time it existed. All these marks, by frequent repetition, have eventually become furrows and blemishes, if one may say so. Therefore, the appearance of the majority of people is calculated to give one a shock at first sight, and it is only by degrees that one becomes accustomed to a face, that is to say, becomes so indifferent to the impression as to be no longer affected by it. but that the predominating facial expression is formed by countless fleeting and characteristic contortions is also the reason why the faces of intellectual men only become molded gradually, and indeed only attain their sublime expression in old age, whilst the portraits of them in their youth only show the first traces of it. But, on the other hand, what has just been said about the shock one receives at first sight coincides with the above remark, that it is only at first sight that a face makes its true and full impression. In order to get a purely objective and true impression of it, we must stand in no kind of relation to the person. Nay, if possible, we must not even have spoken to him. Conversation makes one in some measure friendly disposed, and brings us into a certain rapport, a reciprocal subjective relation, which immediately interferes with our taking an objective view. As everybody strives to win either respect or friendship for himself, a man who is being observed will immediately resort to every act of dissembling and corrupt us with his airs, hypocrisies, and flatteries, so that in a short time we no longer see what the first impression had clearly shown us. It is said that most people gain on further acquaintance, but what ought to be said is that they delude us on further acquaintance. But when these bad traits have an opportunity of showing themselves later on, our first impression generally receives its justification. Sometimes our further acquaintance is a hostile one, in which case it will not be found that people gain by it. Another reason for the apparent advantage of a further acquaintance is that the man whose first appearance repels us, as soon as we converse with him, no longer shows his true being and character, but his education as well. That is to say, not only what he really is by nature, but what he has appropriated from the commonwealth of mankind. 3/4 of what he says does not belong to him, but has been acquired from without, so that we are often surprised to hear such a minotaur speak so humanly. And on a still further acquaintance, the brutality of which his face gave promise will reveal itself in all its glory. Therefore, a man who is gifted with a keen sense of physiognomy should pay careful attention to those verdicts prior to a further acquaintance, and therefore genuine. For the face of a man expresses exactly what he is, and if he deceives us, it is not his own fault, but ours. On the other hand, the words of a man merely state what he thinks, more frequently only what he has learnt, or it may be merely what he pretends to think. Moreover, when we speak to him, nay, only hear others speak to him, our attention is taken away from his real physiognomy, because it is the substance, that which is given fundamentally, and we disregard it, and we only pay attention to his pathognomy, its play of feature while speaking. This, however, is so arranged that the good side is turned upwards. When Socrates said to a youth who was introduced to him, so that he might test his capabilities, "Speak so that I may see you," taking it for granted that he did not simply mean hearing by seeing, he was right insofar it is only in speaking that the features and especially the eyes of a man become animated, and his intellectual powers and capabilities imprint their stamp on his features. We are then in a position to estimate provisionally the degree and capacity of his intelligence, which was precisely Socrates' aim in that case. But on the other hand, it is to be observed, firstly, that this rule does not apply to the moral qualities of a man, which lie deeper, and secondly, that what is gained from an objective point of view by the clear development of a man's countenance while he is speaking, is again from a subjective point of view lost, because of the personal relation into which he immediately enters with us. Occasioning a slight fascination does not leave us unprejudiced observers, as has already been explained. Therefore, From this last standpoint, it might be more correct to say, do not speak in order that I may see you. For to obtain a pure and fundamental grasp of a man's physiognomy, one must observe him when he is alone and left to himself. Any kind of society and conversation with another throw a reflection upon him which is not his own, mostly to his advantage. For he thereby is placed in a condition of action and reaction which exalts him. But, on the contrary, if he is alone and left to himself, immersed in the depths of his own thoughts and sensations, it is only then that he is absolutely and wholly himself. And anyone with a keen, penetrating eye for physiognomy can grasp the general character of his whole being at a glance. For on his face, regarded in and by itself, is indicated the ground tone of all his thoughts and efforts, the irrevocable of his future, and of which he is only conscious when alone. The science of physiognomy is one of the principal means of the knowledge of mankind. Arts of dissimulation do not come within the range of physiognomy, but within that of a mere pathognomy and mimicry. This is precisely why I recommend the physiognomy of a man to be studied when he is alone and left to his own thoughts, and before he has been conversed with, partly because it is only then that his physiognomy can be seen purely and simply, since in conversation pathognomy immediately steps in, and he then resorts to the arts of dissimulation which he has acquired, and partly because personal intercourse, even of the slightest nature, makes us prejudiced and in consequence impairs our judgment. Concerning our physiognomy in general, it is still to be observed that it is much easier to discover the intellectual capacities of a man than his moral character. The intellectual capacities take a much more outward direction. They are expressed not only in the face and play of his features, but also in his walk, nay, in every movement, however slight it may be. One could perhaps discriminate from behind between a blockhead, a fool, and a man of genius. A clumsy awkwardness characterizes every movement of the blockhead. Folly imprints its mark on every gesture, and so do genius and a reflective nature, hence the outcome of Le Bruyère's remark, Il n'y a rien de si délié, de si simple, et de si imperceptible où il n'y entre des manières, qui nous décèlent, un saut ni n'entre, ni ne sort, ni ne s'assied, ni ne s'élève, ni ne se tait, ni ne se séjambe, comme un homme d'esprit. This accounts for, by the way, that instinct se reprend, which, according to Helvetius, ordinary people have of recognizing people of genius and of running away from them. This is to be accounted for by the fact that the larger and more developed the brain, and the thinner in relation to it the spine and nerves, the greater not only is the intelligence, but also at the same time the mobility and pliancy of all the limbs, because they are controlled more immediately and decisively by the brain. Consequently, everything depends more on a single thread, every movement of which precisely expresses its purpose. The whole matter is analogous to, nay, dependent on, the fact that the higher an animal stands in the scale of development, the easier can it be killed by wounding it in a single place. Take, for instance, batrachia. They are as heavy, clumsy, and slow in their movements as they are unintelligent, and at the same time extremely tenacious of life. This is explained by the fact that with a little brain, they have a very thick spine and nerves, but gait and movement of the arms are for the most part functions of the brain, because the limbs receive their motion, and even the slightest modification of it, from the brain through the medium of the spinal nerves. And this is precisely why voluntary movements tire us. This feeling of fatigue, like that of pain, has its seat in the brain, and not as we suppose in the limbs, hence motion promotes sleep. On the other hand, those motions that are not excited by the brain, that is to say, the involuntary motions of organic life, of the heart and lungs, go on without causing fatigue. And as thought as well as motion is a function of the brain, the character of its activity is denoted in both, according to the nature of the individual. Stupid people move like lay figures, while every joint of intellectual people speaks for itself. Intellectual qualities are much better discerned, however, in the face than in the gestures and movements, in the shape and size of the forehead, in the contraction and movement of the features, and especially in the eye, from the little, dull, sleepy-looking eye of the pig, through all gradations to the brilliant, sparkling eye of the genius. The look of wisdom, even of the best kind, is different from that of genius, since it bears the stamp of serving the will, while that of the latter is free from it. Therefore, the anecdote which Scarzafiki relates in his Life of Petrarch, and is taken from Joseph Brivius, a contemporary, is quite credible, namely that when Petrarch was at the court of Visconti, and among many men and titled people, Galeazzo Visconti asked his son, who was still a boy in years and was afterwards the first Duke of Milan, to pick out the wisest man of those present. The boy looked at everyone for a while, when he seized Petrarch's hand and led him to his father, to the great admiration of all present. For nature imprints her stamp of dignity so distinctly on the distinguished among mankind that a child can perceive it. Therefore, I should advise my sagacious countrymen, if they ever again wish to trumpet a commonplace person as a genius for the period of 30 years, not to choose that end such an innkeeper's physiognomy as was possessed by Hegel, upon whose face had written in her clearest handwriting the familiar title, Commonplace Person. But what applies to intellectual qualities does not apply to the moral character of mankind. Its physiognomy is much more difficult to perceive, because, being of a metaphysical nature, it lies much deeper, and although moral character is connected with the constitution and with the organism, it is not so immediately connected, however, with definite parts of its system as his intellect. Hence, while each one makes a public show of his intelligence, with which he is in general quite satisfied, and tries to display it at every opportunity, the moral qualities are seldom brought to light. Nay, most people intentionally conceal them, and long practice makes them acquire great mastery in hiding them. Meanwhile, as has been explained above, wicked thoughts and worthless endeavors gradually leave their traces on the face, and especially the eyes. Therefore, judging by physiognomy, we can easily guarantee that a man will never produce an immortal work, but not that he will never commit a great crime. End of section 23. Recording by David Andrea. Section 24 of Essays of Schopenhauer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Andrea. Essays of Schopenhauer by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by Sara Dircks. On suicide. As far as I can see, it is only the followers of monotheistic, that is of Jewish, religions that regard suicide as a crime. This is the more striking, as there is no forbiddance of it, or even positive disapproval of it, to be found either in the New Testament or the Old. So the teachers of religion have to base their disapprobation of suicide on their own philosophical grounds. These, however, are so bad that they try to compensate for the weakness of their arguments by strongly expressing their abhorrence of the act, that is to say, by abusing it. We are told that suicide is an act of the greatest cowardice, that it is only possible to a madman, and other absurdities of a similar nature, Or they make use of the perfectly senseless expression that it is wrong, while it is perfectly clear that no one has such indisputable right over anything in the world as over his own person and life. Suicide, as has been said, is computed a crime, rendering inevitable, especially in vulgar, bigoted England, an ignominious burial and the confiscation of the property. This is why the jury almost always brings in the verdict of insanity. Let one's own moral feelings decide the matter for one. Compare the impression made upon one by the news that a friend has committed a crime, say a murder, an act of cruelty or deception or theft, with the news that he has died a voluntary death. Whilst news of the first kind will incite intense indignation, the greatest displeasure, and a desire for punishment or revenge, news of the second will move us to sorrow and compassion. Moreover, we will frequently have a feeling of admiration for his courage, rather than one of moral disapproval, which accompanies a wicked act. Who has not had acquaintances, friends, relatives, who have voluntarily left this world? And are we to think of them with horror as criminals? Nego hoc per nego. I am rather of the opinion that the clergy should be challenged to state their authority for stamping, from the pulpit or in their writings, as a crime an act which has been committed by many people honored and loved by us, and refusing an honorable burial to those who have of their own free will left the world. They cannot produce any kind of biblical authority, nay, they have no philosophical arguments that are at all valid, and it is reasons that we want. More empty phrases or words of abuse we cannot accept. If the criminal law forbids suicide, then it is not a reason that holds good in the church. Moreover, it is extremely ridiculous, for what punishment can frighten those who seek death? When a man is punished for trying to commit suicide, it is his clumsy failure that is punished. The ancients were also very far from looking at the matter in this light. Pliny says, Vitam quidam non deo expendum gensimus, ut quoque modo trahenda sit, quisquis estaris, eque moriare, etiam cum obscurnis fixaris, aut nefandus, qua propter ac primum quisqui in remedis animi sui habeat, ex omnibus bonus, quae homini tribuit natura, nullum melius esse tempestiva morte, id quia nea optimum, quod illum sibi quisqui prestare poterit. He also says, Ne diem quidem posse omnia, namque nec sibi potest mortem concescere, si velit, quod homini dedit optimum in danis vitae poenis, etc. In Massilia and on the island of Chaos, a hemlock potion was offered in public by the magistrate to those who could give valid reasons for quitting this life. And how many heroes and wise men of ancient times have not ended their lives by a voluntary death? To be sure, Aristotle says, suicide is a wrong against the state, although not against the person. Stobaeus, however, in his treatise on the Peripatetic Ethics, uses this sentence. Psefton diton bion gigneste, tis menagathis and tis achan etuchies, tis tekakis gein tis achan etuchies. Vitum autum reliquendam esse bonis nimis quident miseris, bravis vero in nimium quoque secundus. And similarly, Dio quae gamisin, quae pedois este, quae paletus este, etc., quae cathalu dinaretin aoconta, quae menin en tobio, quae palin e dei pota dianancas apalagis estae, tafes pronovisanta, etc. Idioqui et uxorum ductorum, et liberos procreatorum, et civitatem excessorum, etc. Atque omnio virtutum colendo, dum vitam salvatorum tumitorum, cogum necessitate relictorum, etc. And we find that suicide was actually praised by the Stoics as a noble and heroic act. This is corroborated by hundreds of passages, and especially in the works of Seneca. Further, it is well known that the Hindus often look upon suicide as a religious act, as, for instance, the self-sacrifice of widows, throwing oneself under the wheels of the chariot of the god at Juggernaut, or giving oneself to the crocodiles in the Ganges, or casting oneself in the holy tanks in the temples, and so on. It is the same on the stage, that mirror of life. For instance, in the famous Chinese play, Le Fainéant de la Chine, almost all the noble characters end by suicide, without indicating anywhere or at striking the spectator that they were committing a crime. At bottom, it is the same on our own stage. For instance, Palmyra and Mahomet, Mortimer and Maria Stuart, Othello, Countess Tersky. Is Hamlet's monologue the meditation of a criminal? He merely states that, considering the nature of the world, death would be certainly preferable if we were sure that by it we should be annihilated. But there lies the rub. By the reasons brought to bear against suicide by the priests of monotheistic, that is, of Jewish, religions, and by those philosophers who adapt themselves to it, are weak sophisms easily contradicted. Hume has furnished the most thorough refutation of them in his essay on suicide, which did not appear until after his death, and was immediately suppressed by the shameful bigotry and gross ecclesiastical tyranny existing in England. Hence, only a very few copies of it were sold secretly, and those at a dear price. And for this and another treatise of that great man, we are indebted to a reprint published at Basel. That a purely philosophical treatise originating from one of the greatest thinkers and writers of England, which refuted with cold reason the current arguments against suicide, must steal about in that country as if it were a fraudulent piece of work, until it found protection in a foreign country, is a great disgrace to the English nation. At the same time, it shows what a good conscience the Church has on a question of this kind. The only valid moral reason against suicide has been explained in my chief work. It is this: that suicide prevents the attainment of the highest moral aim, since it substitutes a real release from this world of misery for one that is merely apparent. But there is a very great difference between a mistake and a crime, and it is as a crime that the Christian clergy wish to stamp it. Christianity's inmost truth is that suffering, the cross, is the real purpose of life. Hence it condemns suicide as thwarting this end, while the ancients, from a lower point of view, approved of it, nay, honored it. This argument against suicide is nevertheless ascetic, and only holds good from a much higher ethical standpoint than has ever been taken by moral philosophers in Europe. But if we come down from that very high standpoint, there is no longer a valid moral reason for condemning suicide. The extraordinarily active zeal with which the clergy of monotheistic religions attack suicide is not supported either by the Bible or by any valid reasons. So it looks as if their zeal must be instigated by some secret motive. May it not be that the voluntary sacrificing of one's life is a poor compliment to him who said, Pantakalalian. In that case, it would be another example of the gross optimism of these religions denouncing suicide in order to avoid being denounced by it. As a rule, it will be found that as soon as the terrors of life outweigh the terrors of death, a man will put an end to his life. The resistance of the terrors of death is, however, considerable. They stand like a sentinel at the gate that leads out of life. Perhaps there is no one living who would not have already put an end to his life if this end had been something that was purely negative, a sudden cessation of existence. But there is something positive about it, namely the destruction of the body, and this alarms a man simply because his body is the manifestation of his will to live. Meanwhile, the fight as a rule with these sentinels is not so hard as it may appear to be from a distance. In consequence, it is true of the antagonism between mental and physical suffering. For instance, if we suffer very great bodily pain, or if the pain lasts a long time, we become indifferent to all other troubles. Our recovery is what we desire most dearly. In the same way, great mental suffering makes us insensible to bodily suffering. We despise it. Nay, if it outweighs the other, we find it a beneficial distraction, a pause in our mental suffering. And so it is that suicide becomes easy, for the bodily pain that is bound up with it loses all importance in the eyes of one who is tormented by excessive mental suffering. This is particularly obvious in the case of those who are driven to commit suicide through some purely morbid and discordant feeling. They have no feelings to overcome. They do not need to rush at it, but as soon as the keeper who looks after them leaves for 2 minutes, they quickly put an end to their life. When in some horrid and frightful dream we reach the highest pitch of terror, it awakens us, gathering all the monsters of the night. The same thing happens in the dream of life, when the greatest degree of terror compels us to break it off. Suicide may also be looked upon as an experiment, as a question which man puts to nature and compels her to answer. It asks, what change a man's existence and knowledge of things experience through death? It is an awkward experiment to make, for it destroys the very consciousness that awaits the answer. End of section 24. End of Essays of Schopenhauer by Arthur Schopenhauer, translated by Sara Dircks.